on southern Lebanon over the past couple of days, including yesterday, including as talks were underway in Pakistan, which were supposed to include discussion of Lebanon. We still had strikes all across southern Lebanon. The situation was a little bit lighter around Beirut and its southern suburbs. We had a little bit fewer strikes than we had seen over the past couple of days, but those preceding days were some of the heaviest. And we continue to have Israeli surveillance drones flying over the capital. So although we didn't hear the strikes and the pounding that we had heard over Wednesday, which was a particularly heavy day, we did continue to hear that buzzing sound of the drone all across Beirut into the late evening yesterday.
So scary. I'm so sorry you're going through that. We have heard reports of journalists speaking to families trying to identify their loved ones, in some cases from remains. Just how severe is the civilian toll now, and how is that affecting daily life in the city?
Wednesday was one of the deadliest days for the Lebanese capital and for Lebanon as a whole in recent history. There were Israeli strikes all across Beirut, across the southern suburbs, the south, the east of the country, all within a span of 10 minutes, 100 airstrikes just pummeling the country nearly simultaneously, and more than 350 people were killed across the country just in that day alone. So I spent some time at a hospital in Beirut where people were coming in to try to identify their loved ones, and it was extremely gruesome. Just like you said, I mean, they were trying to basically put bodies together from different body parts that had been blown apart, and there was a lot of women and children that were included in those strikes. Israel had said that it is targeting Hezbollah members, but it was targeting extremely densely populated neighborhoods, and instead of using the precision drone strikes that we have seen them use in many occasions across Beirut in the past, they used a lot of bombing that left entire buildings pulverized and bodies under the rubble for the hours to come and days to come. Rescuers were still working yesterday even to try to get bodies out from under the rubble. It was one of the gruesome weeks that Lebanon has seen, unfortunately, in a very difficult couple of years, but Wednesday in particular was a very, very heavy and dark day for all of Lebanon.
I can't even imagine, because as you're just speaking there, we're looking at videos just showing what's been going on the ground. It's absolutely awful. As you say, these were some of the heaviest strikes on Beirut in years. What are Israeli officials saying now about their objectives at this point, and how is Hezbollah responding on the ground too?
So Hezbollah on the first day of what it thought was going to be a ceasefire on Wednesday morning, it actually stopped firing at Israeli troops within Lebanon and at Israeli military positions across the border in northern Israel. By Wednesday afternoon, when that heavy barrage of strikes took place, that's when the group started to resume airstrikes.
And asked the U.S. Vice President what ultimately led to the deadlock shortly after the talks concluded.
The simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations.
And as these high-stakes talks were happening, President Trump was attending a martial arts championship in Miami. And some reporters actually caught a glimpse of him just moments after his vice president said that he was headed home pretty much empty-handed. CNN's Julia Benbrook with the details from Florida.
While United States negotiators, including Vice President JD Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner were in Islamabad for these talks with the Iranians, President Donald Trump was here in Florida at a social gathering at the UFC fights, surrounded by family. We also know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there, and according to reporters in the room, around that same time that Vance came out and announced that an agreement had not been met, Rubio was seen leaning over to whisper something to Trump there during those fights. We don't know for sure if that was the topic of discussion, but it does seem likely. Now, as Trump traveled out here, he did take some questions from reporters at the White House, and he said he was getting updates on these hours-long talks as they were taking place, but that from his viewpoint, it didn't really matter how the talks went because he believes that the United States has already won this conflict militarily. Take a listen.
We win. No matter what, we've defeated their military. They have no navy. 158 ships are underwater, undersea. All of their minesweepers and all of their, they call them mine droppers. Can you imagine? A country has 28 mine droppers. You think that's nice? With all of that being said, they're all defeated, by the way. They're all at the bottom of the sea. Now, with all of that, they have no navy. They have no radar. They have no air force. Their leaders are all dead. with Khomeini is gone. For many years he ruled. He's gone. With all of that, let's see what happens. But from my standpoint, I don't care.
Now, those comments came before the official announcement that there had not been an agreement. And Vance outlined that there were certain things that the Iranians were not able to commit to that were red lines for the Trump administration, specifically when it comes to nuclear weapons. I want to read for you part of his remarks. He said, quote, "The simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon." Now, that echoes some comments that we heard from Trump several weeks ago now when he was speaking to a group of Republican lawmakers here in Florida. He said, "We've already won in many ways, but we haven't won enough." I pressed him on what he meant by that. What would be enough? What was his baseline for ending this conflict? And that's when he said that they needed to be able to look at negotiators. He referenced Witkoff, who was in the room at the time, but that they needed to be able to look at those negotiators and confirm that they were not going to pursue a nuclear weapon. Vance is saying they did not get that commitment. Traveling with the president in Florida, Julia Benbrook, CNN.
Pakistan says that it will continue to mediate between Iran and the U.S. in the coming days. Vice President JD Vance thanking the Pakistani government for their tireless work to, as he put it, to bridge the gap between Washington and Tehran. But one of the unanswered questions still is, what does the breakdown of the talks mean for the country that was acting as a key mediator in this conflict? Joining us now is Moeed Yusuf. He's a former national security advisor to the former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan. He's also a senior fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Moeed, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Right off the top, before we get to just Pakistan's role in all of this, I'm wondering if I could just get your immediate reaction to what we heard hours ago from the U.S. Vice President, that despite hours of these negotiations, that unfortunately no deal has been reached between the U.S. and Iran. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking news, frankly. I think, there were three sides here, and it was pretty clear in the way they approached this, the delegations that were there, the role that Pakistan played, that all of them were there to make a deal. And unfortunately, they walked away clearly not having one. I think this is terrible news for those who thought this war was over and done with, and we could find a way to move forward with some kind of regional stability. I think if you saw President Vance's body language, he was deflated, he was frustrated, and I can tell you that on the Pakistani side, there's genuine heartbreak because they tried very, very hard to get this through. I'm told that the delta was just simply too wide, and they've left the room unclear whether there's going to be any response from the Iranians after that. And what comes next, we don't know, but it doesn't look good, unfortunately.
These make-or-break talks, I mean, these were hosted by the Pakistani government in Islamabad. One of the things that perhaps we haven't focused a whole lot on is just the people in Pakistan and how they were seeing and viewing and following these talks. I want you to hear just a brief interview with a Pakistani doctor who speaks English, telling my colleagues basically what these talks mean for the Pakistani people, and then we'll discuss.
I definitely do feel proud because our country has been on the low, particularly in the eyes of lots of other countries in the West. So I'm glad that we're stepping up, we're doing something really important and helpful and crucial that's going to affect almost the entire world, I think.
Yeah, Hassan Abbasi there touches on an important point, and that is his hope that this would perhaps address various perceptions, especially in the eyes of some Western countries, according to him. So I'm curious, in your view, how much did Pakistan stand to gain, regardless of the outcome, by simply hosting these crucial talks on their turf?
Yeah, frankly, I don't know, Paul, how much Pakistan was going to gain at the end of the day, but it's quite clear that Pakistan had become the center of the world for these past few days. And for Pakistan, this wasn't really about making something out of this as much as it was about ensuring that the war didn't restart. There's also definitely self-interest. Pakistan's a country that's directly affected because of the energy, because of a long border with Iran. It has deep sectarian ties. It has a defense pact with Saudi Arabia. It doesn't want to get pulled into the conflict actively. For multiple reasons, Pakistan wanted this to work out. But really, the way it's come about doing this, we had a unique position, I think, this time as Pakistan. Nobody else could speak to the US, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and China at the same time. And so, yes, there was a real high in Pakistan, a lot of praise coming Pakistan's way, but a lot of responsibility on Pakistan's shoulders today as well, which unfortunately, as we know now, has not panned out as they had hoped.
Yeah, I know. I mean, during last summer's bombardment of Iranian targets, I mean, I would have been shocked if you would have told me that these two nations would be under the same roof in 2026. So that alone, in most eyes, could be seen as at least some progress, despite the negative outcome thus far. Do you think that the Pakistani government will continue to see itself as a moderator in this war?
I think so. I think, look, Pakistan started off being a go-between. It was essentially passing on messages from the US to Iran and back. But today it was very clear that Pakistan was an active mediator. The Pakistani army chief was in the room. Pakistan actually made proposals to extend the talks when they seemed to be faltering. And I think Pakistan's not going to give up. Pakistan is going to try and, push, I think, Iran further, perhaps talk to President Trump. My own sense is Pakistan's going to make a beeline to China as well to try and bring China back in to see if there can be more flexibility brought in on the Iranian side. But at the end of the day, Paul, I think the problem is that on the fundamental issues, Vice President Vance only mentioned nuclear. But I think on nuclear, on the Strait, and on the issue of Lebanon, on all three, there is some gap that still needs to be filled. Now, let me also say that despite this breakdown, we are still in a far better position than we were before these negotiations took place. If we hadn't gotten to the ceasefire, things would have been far worse. Technically, the ceasefire still holds for another week. Now, we don't know whether that will be the case or not. I think President Trump will make that decision once he talks to or meets Vice President Vance. But I do think Pakistan's going to try. I do think other countries are going to still try and see if something can be worked out. But then there are countries like Israel who have been very clear that they were not interested in this. They were hoping this didn't work out. And my own sense is that they're going to use this opportunity to go back into Lebanon, sooner rather than later. So a lot of issues here still to be worked out, obviously. I don't see much possibility that Iran would accept the framework that the US delegation has left with them, because if they had to, they were empowered to, and they could have done it on the spot. So unfortunately, we're looking at a fairly dicey situation, but I don't think Pakistan's about to give up. I don't think other countries would give up. The stakes are just too high, and the danger of this spiraling out of control again is very, very real if we don't get something out of this within the framework of the ceasefire.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that he is not done with Iran yet, despite the current ceasefire. He made those comments on Saturday as peace talks were still underway between the U.S. and Iran.
The campaign is not over yet, but we can clearly state that we have historic achievements. I want to remind where we were. Iran tried to strangle us. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Assad regime in Syria, the militia in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Iran itself. They wanted to strangle us, and we strangled them. They threatened us with destruction, and now they are fighting to survive. We affected them, and we have more to do.
Netanyahu also said that he has approved direct talks with Lebanon next week as Israel ramps up attacks on Hezbollah targets. The Iranian-backed militant group has also continued firing at Israel, launching a barrage of drones and rockets on Saturday. Iran is insisting that a broader ceasefire must include an end to Israeli strikes in Lebanon. CNN's Oren Lieberman reporting.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the campaign against Iran is not yet over, a statement he made even as the U.S. and Iran were engaged in the first day of ceasefire talks in Pakistan aimed at finding an end to the war. Netanyahu, in a 13-minute televised statement in Hebrew, listed what he said were Israel's major accomplishments during the war, including killing much of Iran's top leadership and destroying much of its ballistic missile infrastructure, its nuclear infrastructure, and its military assets. He also said Iran continued to hold highly enriched uranium, and that would have to be dealt with either by an agreement or by other means. He said he and President Donald Trump are in lockstep on this. He said these had been major accomplishments that only could have been achieved in the joint military effort. Now, it's noteworthy that he's saying this because a series of polls last week in Israel found that a majority of Israelis believed the U.S. and Israel had not won the war against Iran. So it's noteworthy here that you see Netanyahu coming out trying to list the accomplishments of the war so far and saying the campaign isn't over yet. Netanyahu also addressed Lebanon. He said he had authorized direct talks between Israel and Lebanon, and he put two conditions on this. First, he said the talks and any agreement must include the disarmament of Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Lebanon, and that it must be a true peace agreement, one that he said would last for generations. Now, what happens in Lebanon is important for Iran, and that's because Iran has said the ceasefire must include the cessation of hostilities and the cessation of the war in Lebanon. But the U.S. and Israel see that differently. Israel has continued to carry out strikes in Lebanon against Hezbollah and targeting Iran's proxy there. The Israeli military said they have struck more than 200 targets in Lebanon between Friday and Saturday. So you see Israel continuing the war there, even as the U.S. and Iran are engaged in ceasefire talks, and the U.S. will host direct talks between Israel and Lebanon next week. Oren Lieberman, CNN in Jerusalem.
And there's a new poll that's showing that Israel may be losing support among Americans. That's according to the Pew Research Center. According to them, 6 in 10 Americans have an unfavorable view of Israel, and that's up 7 points since last year and nearly 20 points since 2022. And this poll you're looking at, it was taken about 1 month into the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran. 59% of Americans surveyed said that they have little or no confidence in Netanyahu to do the right thing regarding world affairs. And the majority of younger Americans on both sides of the aisle Israel and Netanyahu negatively. U.S. delegation led by Vice President JD Vance leaving Pakistan without reaching a deal with the war in Iran. We'll tell you what Iran's regime just said about those talks. And Israel's prime minister saying that his country's campaign in Iran is not done, as a new poll shows that the Israeli government is losing support among some Americans. And after splashing down from a historic lunar mission, we hear from the Artemis II astronauts.
Live from New York, this is CNN Newsroom with Polo Sandoval.
All right, right now we're following breaking news out of Pakistan. The U.S. delegation has left Islamabad and now headed back to Washington after unsuccessful marathon peace talks with Iran. Just moments ago, Iran state media citing a source close to the negotiating team saying currently there is, quote, no plan for a next round of negotiations. And this is all now leading to uncertainty for millions of people in the Middle East, as well as the fates of the global economy. Vice President JD Vance giving this update on those talks before his departure.
We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
He said those terms include a, quote, affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon. And Iranian media reporting that until the U.S. agrees to a reasonable deal, there will be no change in the status of the Strait of Hormuz. CNN's Nick Robertson begins our coverage from Islamabad.
So this is where we just heard from the vice president. No deal on the talks with Iran over 16 hours, an absolute marathon session through the night here in the center of Islamabad. It is dawn now. When the talks began on Saturday, it was late afternoon, and we've quite literally witnessed the sun go down and then the sun come up again. And what the vice president has said is that Iran, he doesn't believe, is giving that fundamental core agreement about its nuclear aspirations. He didn't say what happens next. He didn't talk about a specific end to the ceasefire. He didn't say if it's a return to war. But what he said the United States has done is given Iran its final and best offer. The ball, it appears, is in Iran's court to come up with answers now that it hasn't been able to through this marathon session of talks. The vice president also saying that through the night he continually kept President Trump briefed and updated. He said that he'd come into these talks positive, but fundamentally the vice president coming in looking, he hoped, to get a relatively quick solution. The Iranians with a much larger delegation and a much different negotiating style coming into these talks with perhaps the aspiration, as they have done in the past, of talking, drilling down, getting what they wanted. Fundamentally, also, the Iranians believe that they still hold cards, that they can still control the Strait of Hormuz, and to them, that is something that is leverage, real leverage, they believe, and that it could get more than they were offered here in Islamabad.
All right, let's bring in CNN's Will Ripley live from Taipei, Taiwan. Will, it's good to see you again. The big question, what next?
Well, you know, we were talking yesterday, Polo, about this CNN reporting that sources in Washington, speaking to our Washington bureau, believe that China might be preparing a shipment of weapons to send to Iran. You know, this 2-week ceasefire potentially giving Iran time to regroup and grow its stockpiles, particularly of these man-pads, the man-portable air defense systems that one person can operate, and with a heat-seeking missile, total cost of a few $100,000, they can aim it at a low-flying aircraft like a helicopter or a fighter jet and shoot the thing down, as we believe we saw, according to President Trump, with that American F-15. So clearly Iran is in no hurry to find a quick resolution to this. They feel like they have all the leverage. They now control and are even reportedly charging tolls for tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, although only a handful of tankers have gotten through, 2 of them at least Chinese. So what this means at this point, no deal, it doesn't mean that talks are dead, but it means that the ceasefire that is still in place for another week or so, just over a week, is incredibly fragile, and you have a lot of key sticking points where there is a tremendous amount of sunshine between the United States and Iran, things like Iran's nuclear program, sanctions relief, war reparations that Tehran is demanding, Lebanon, and then, of course, the most crucial issue here in Asia, Polo, the Strait of Hormuz. And until the strait fully reopens, Asia will literally be living on the edge. You're talking about countries across Asia with a supply of energy and oil that's used not just for, you know, electricity, but also for cooking, transportation. And these national supplies, which are already running tight, they're already long queues in a lot of countries, it could run out in a matter of weeks. And they're trying to regroup. The U.S. is now going to be exporting more energy to this part of the world, but setting up those supply chains takes a lot of time. So there is a very immediate potential energy and economic crisis, the likes of which we haven't fully realized how horribly impactful that could be yet. And so you heard Vice President JD Vance say that it's not good for Iran that these talks fell apart, but it is very devastating news for a lot of other stakeholders, particularly here in Asia, where about 80% of the oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz is bound for nations with capitals that are waiting with bated breath to see this thing resolved, from Beijing to Tokyo to right here in Taipei and New Delhi. This disruption is going to be hitting energy prices even harder than it already is, not to mention shipping. It's going to be causing inflation. It's going to be cutting down on growth. So it's a big problem well beyond the Middle East if this thing drags on. And Iran is sitting in a seat where they know that, and they feel like they can get more than what the vice president of the U.S. offered, even though he did say, Polo, it was his best and final offer. We'll see.
Yeah, well, and just to underscore your previous point of time really being on Iran's side, it was Iranian state media that just said a short while ago, Iran is in no hurry. Will Ripley in Taipei, thank you. Benjamin Rad joining me from Los Angeles. He's a political scientist and senior fellow at the UCLA Berkeley Center. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you were following those talks through the night, and now we have that announcement from the vice president. You have the U.S. saying that it left behind its, quote, final and best offer, but you also have Iran saying that not only time is on their side, as we just heard, but that we should expect no further negotiations from them. So I'll pose the same question to you. What do you think happens next?
So this was to be expected. You had the two delegations coming with their maximalist positions. You have high-level talks for the first time since 1979, really, and coming in the wake of a war, a very destructive war that ran for 6 weeks, followed by a previous one from last summer. Understandable that they're going to come in with their demands high, and neither looking to compromise until they feel that the other has demonstrated that they have less leverage. In other words, for Iran, they've come in thinking they have this key position over the United States with regard to the control over the Strait of Hormuz. And for the United States, they believe that they can sustain the attacks that have devastated Iran's infrastructure and really decimated much of its national security and military. But until, I guess, either one decides that they're going to compromise and take a step forward, the question is, if we wait out these next, the remainder of this 2-week ceasefire, which country, which group suffers more? Is it going to be President Trump politically, keeping the sort of uncertainty of the war going and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, or will it be Iran, which still faces tremendous domestic pressure?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting that the vice president did not mention the Strait of Hormuz during those relatively short remarks before leaving Islamabad. But I think it really does give us a sense that the nuclear stockpile remains a sticking point, as it's been really since February, but before some of the first shots were fired. So what did you make of the vice president saying that Iran is currently not committed to announcing that it would not build a nuclear weapon?
Well, from Iran's position, they'll maintain that that's what the Iran deal of 2015 was. The JCPOA was a pledge on their part to not build a weapon. And they're also members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're signatories, meaning that they have committed to not acquiring the technology for a weapon or developing one of their own. The issue remains Iran's enrichment to breakout levels, basically to a threshold beyond what the NPT, the treaty, allows, and close to nuclear bomb territory. So from Iran's position, it has the absolute right as a sovereign nation to enrich uranium. And the United States is maintaining that Iran has forfeit the trust and the right under the NPT to enrich uranium. So therein lies the impasse. Can Iran be trusted to operate within IAEA limits and safeguards? The United States believes that Iran has essentially forfeited that, given its past actions at deceiving international inspectors. And Iran feels that it does not need to give that up, especially now that it has the Strait of Hormuz.
News out of Islamabad, Pakistan, where in the last hour the U.S. delegation just departed after marathon peace talks with Iran ended at an impasse. Vice President JD Vance, shortly before leaving the location that you see here, well, he offered this update on the talks before leaving.
We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Well, the vice president said that those terms include a, quote, affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, referring to Iran. Now, Iranian media blaming Washington's overreach and ambitions for the breakdown in talks. In the meantime, Vice President Vance did not say whether Tehran would reopen that critical Strait of Hormuz. Out of Pakistan, the U.S. delegation has left Islamabad and now headed back to Washington, this after unsuccessful marathon peace talks with Iran. Vice President JD Vance giving this update on the talks shortly before the delegation's departure.
We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Well, the vice president said that those terms include a, quote, affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon. Iranian media blaming Washington's, quote, overreach and ambitions for the breakdown in talks. And now that the peace talks have broken down, the future of the U.S. and Israel's war with Iran remains in question. CNN's Nick Robertson was there and pressed the vice president for more information in Islamabad.
So this is where we just heard from the vice president. No deal on the talks with Iran over 16 hours, an absolute marathon session through the night here in the center of Islamabad. It is dawn now. When the talks began on Saturday, it was late afternoon, and we've quite literally witnessed the sun go down and then the sun come up again. And what the vice president has said is that Iran, he doesn't believe, is giving that fundamental core agreement about its nuclear aspirations. He didn't say what happens next. He didn't talk about a specific end to the ceasefire. He didn't say if it's a return to war. But what he said the United States has done is given Iran its final and best offer. The ball, it appears, is in Iran's court to come up with answers now that it hasn't been able to through this marathon session of talks. The vice president also saying that through the night he continually kept President Trump briefed and updated. He said that he'd come into these talks positive, but fundamentally the vice president coming in looking, he hoped, to get a relatively quick solution. The Iranians with a much larger delegation and a much different negotiating style coming into these talks with perhaps the aspiration, as they have done in the past, of talking, drilling down, getting what they wanted. Fundamentally, also, the Iranians believe that they still hold cards, that they can still control the Strait of Hormuz, and to them, that is something that is leverage, real leverage, they believe, and that it could get more than they were offered here in Islamabad.
Our thanks to Nick Robertson and his team for following those talks throughout the entire night. Let's get some more reporting now and head over to CNN's Will Ripley, joining me live from Taipei. Will, it's good to see you. I know you were following those talks closely as well. At this point, do we know just how long Iran may have to respond to what JD referred as the U.S.'s final and best offer?
He didn't say that specifically, but we know that they had agreed to this 2-week ceasefire, which would end, depending on which part of the world you're in, April 21st or 22nd, so just over a week from now. So let's assume that the ceasefire holds until then, which is very much an open question right now, Polo. Obviously, no deal does not mean that these talks are dead. Stage is incredibly fragile. The key sticking points you've already laid out: Iran's nuclear program, sanctions relief, war reparations is what Iran wants, as well as this crucial issue of Lebanon. And here in Asia, the biggest and most important, of course, is the reopening and the stabilization of the Strait of Hormuz. And until that happens, Asia is going to be incredibly tense, because this is the biggest consumer of the world. It's moving through the world's biggest oil checkpoint. About 80% of the oil passing through the strait is bound for Asia. So obviously these talks matter. As everybody around the world knows, they matter far beyond the Middle East, from Beijing to Tokyo to here in Taipei to New Delhi. Disruption in Hormuz basically hits things like energy prices, shipping, inflation, growth. And shipping is really going to be the first real test of this ceasefire. When will it start moving normally again? That's the big question. So far, as we've been able to monitor a few tankers that have passed, mainly Chinese. Japan's prime minister, she has been pressing Tehran on the security of the Strait of Hormuz, because Tokyo relies on about 90% of its oil from the Middle East passing through the strait. Asia is adapting right now. U.S. energy exports to Asia are actually surging, but it takes a long time to get those supply chains going, and that would not alleviate the crisis crisis if this conflict does continue beyond a matter of several weeks. Most countries in this region have a plan getting them through maybe the month of April into early May, but after that it's going to be real touch and go right as we enter into the hot summer months when people are turning on the air conditioning and relying on the energy to work. So it could be a huge mess, not to mention, of course, transportation and all of the other things that you rely on for energy in this part of the region and part of the world, Polo. Pakistan, the one country that really is emerging from this as a winner, even though these talks have not produced a result, to be able to stand on the global stage as the host of this, it's certainly a big diplomatic win for Pakistan. But a lot of other countries around the world that were hoping for a quick resolution to this are feeling like they're potentially on the losing side, Polo.
That's CNN's Will Ripley with the live report. Let's stay on that topic that Will raises, the issue about Pakistan. Vice President Vance thanking that country's government for their tireless work to bridge the gap between Washington and Tehran. But one of the unanswered questions now is, what does the breakdown of the talks mean for that country that's really been a key mediator in this conflict? It's where the marathon peace talks between the U.S. and Iran have ended in an impasse. CNN's Nick Robertson was there asking Vice President JD Vance, who led that U.S. delegation, what led to this deadlock. Here's what he said.
We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
And the vice president and the rest of the U.S. delegation headed back to the U.S. with still a host of questions lingering about the ongoing war. Vice President Vance, he did not say whether Tehran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And even before the talks had concluded, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had announced that the military campaign against Iran was not over yet. Our continuing coverage a little later here on CNN. I'm Polo Sandoval. African Voices is next, and I'll be back at the top of the hour with another update.
Well, good morning, everybody. And let me say a couple of notes of appreciation. First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis, who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms. Questions?
Sir, Nick Robertson from CNN. Precisely what have they rejected here? Can you help us understand it a little bit?
Well, I won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term? We haven't seen that yet. We hope that we will. Jen.
Was there a framework on anything? And also, did the Iranian frozen assets come up, and did you reach any conclusions on those frozen assets?
We talked about all those issues, Jen, and we talked about a number of issues beyond that. And so certainly those things came up. But again, we just could not get to a situation where the Iranians were willing to accept our terms. I think that we were quite flexible. We were quite accommodating. The president told us, you need to come here in good faith and make your best effort to get a deal. We did that. And unfortunately, we weren't able to make any headway. Preston.
Mr. Vice President, how often did you communicate with President Trump throughout the negotiations? There were reports that there were multiple rounds where there were breaks in between negotiations. How often did you communicate with the president throughout those rounds, and what was he saying as you were going through these negotiations that you said fell short?
Yeah, obviously we were talking to the president consistently. I don't know how many times we talked to him, a half dozen times, a dozen times over the past 21 hours. We obviously also talked to Admiral Cooper, to Pete, to Marco, to the entire national security team. We talked to Scott Bessent a number of times. So look, we were constantly in communication with the team because we were negotiating in good faith. And we leave here with a very simple proposal, a method of understanding that is our final and best offer. We'll see if the Iranians accept it. Thank you.
Mr. Vice President, where does this lead the Strait of Hormuz?
Did you go back to Prime Minister Netanyahu at all today? What about the Strait of Hormuz?
All right, that update that just... All right, and that marks the conclusion now of those remarks that came from the Vice President, JD Vance, offering that update. The headline, they have not chosen to accept our terms, referring to the Iranian delegation that met there for a total of 21 hours of talks, according to the Vice President, with that simple proposal that has been put there on the table. Let's go to Nick Robertson now, who's live there in Islamabad. Nick, I heard you pressing the vice president, trying to expand on where those sticking points are. Tell us more about what he said.
Look, I think one of the takeaways here is also what was not said, and the vice president did sort of get this question at the end, which is essentially, what next? Is it a return to war? And he said, we've given them the final and best offer. So it does appear as if the ball is now in the Iranian court, something that their top negotiating team, and we understand they had a very big delegation here, could not amongst themselves put an adequate answer to. It is clear that if there are going to be more talks and if they're going to be entered into in a productive way, Iran will have to have changed its position somehow. But I think the details that we have here are enough for us to understand that a question mark, a fundamental question mark, now stands. How long does Iran have to come back with its next answer to the final and best offer from the United States? How long do they have to make that decision? And what are the consequences if they don't? Remember, going into this ceasefire, it was just 3 hours away from what the president had described as a civilizational annihilation. He was talking about a massive round of attacks on key Iranian infrastructure, bridges, power plants, rail networks. All these sorts of potential targets were quite literally on the table, and as we understood it, dialed into to munitions that were ready to be delivered onto those targets. So when does that come into play again? Does it come into play? We're again, I think, left with a lot of questions, but I think there have been a real hope overnight tonight that the fact that the talks had gone so long, the fact that they had tried to push so many hours into the early hours this morning to get a successful resolution, really had sort of built a sense of hope that maybe that this was a job that was being done, just taking time. But I think what we've witnessed here tonight is the fundamental gaps and differences between the Iranian side, and of course we know that they fundamentally believe that they still have a military capacity, a quantity of drones, a quantity of ballistic missiles, the ability to hit fundamental and key targets, as they did on Wednesday after the ceasefire deadline, such as the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, a very important pipeline. Iran was demonstrating that it felt it had the ability to come back into the battle should it restart and inflict pain, not only potentially on U.S.-associated shipping, but on the United States Gulf allies and partners. So this is I think it would be too much to describe it at this moment as a setback, because as far as we know, we're still in a ceasefire, but it is a fundamental blow to that aspiration that an off-ramp, an adequate off-ramp could be put into play, and the oil, the natural gas, all those tankers that are stuck in the Gulf at the moment could exit the Strait of Hormuz. All that still seems to be in effect in suspended animation. Of course, we may learn more details about this from the Iranian side, how they interpret it, but we do know that Iranian state media just over the past few hours have been talking about the extreme pressure that they were being put on by the United States delegation. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that Iran typically negotiates over the long term. The two sides came into this with fundamentally different positions. The vice president really felt that he could sort of make a judgment relatively quickly, that he appeared to want to try to do things quickly. And the Iranians' way of negotiating is a fundamentally much slower process, and that does appear to be part of what we've witnessed, not just a difference in what both sides wanted, but a difference in the way they set about trying to achieve it.
And when it comes to some of those differences, the vice president telling you, Nick, that there's a lack of an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon or tools to achieve a nuclear weapon, referring to their uranium stockpile. Nick Payne-Walsh, again, asking those questions to the vice president as we receive. Again, Nick Robertson, thank you so much for being there, asking those questions to the vice president to try to get more clarity on the situation there. My understanding is that the vice president said that he has communications already established with the president. Any indication, Julia, that that we'll be hearing from President Trump?
We still have not heard from President Donald Trump directly. We know that he is here in a social setting at the UFC fights. And according to reporters in the room, he has lots of family members there, but also Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And from those notes that we're getting from the reporters that are there, we know that around this same time that Vice President JD Vance came out and made this announcement that there was no deal, that these talks had not been successful. We know that Rubio leaned over and he whispered something to the president. They described it as he had his hands up, couldn't read his lips. You couldn't tell what he was saying, but safe to assume this may have had something to do with this topic. Now, prior to these talks, Vance had said that he believed that this could be positive, but that Trump had given them these guidelines going into this. They knew what they were looking for, and ultimately they did not find it. And I want to play for you some of what Vance said today about where these sticking points were and what happened.
We say a couple of notes of appreciation. First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis, who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms. Questions?
And so you hear Vance say there that this is much worse for them than it is for us. That echoes what we heard from Trump when he traveled out here to Florida today. As he left the White House, he answered some questions, and he ultimately said that it didn't really matter from his viewpoint how these talks went, because he believed that the United States had already won militarily. He did not believe that these talks had to be successful to claim a win here. Now, Vance, when he went into details on the red line and exactly what the United States was looking for, I want to read for you part of what he said. He said, "The simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon." He said that they did not receive that. And that echoes something that we heard from Trump here just several weeks ago while I was in Florida. He gave his first press conference since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury. And in remarks to Republican lawmakers right before that press conference, he said, we've already won in many ways, but we haven't won enough. And I was able to press him on that. What was enough? What was his baseline for ending this conflict? And he said that they had to be able to confirm that they were not going to pursue a nuclear weapon. They had to look at negotiators like Witkoff, who was in the room. Of course, he's there in Islamabad as well, playing a key role here. But they had to be able to look at people like him and confirm that they weren't going to take steps toward it.
Julia Benbrook, thank you so much for that. Do let us know if we hear from the president there in Florida where you are. Let's go to, now if we could go to David Sanger, who's also been closely following the situation. He's a CNN political and national security analyst and also a reporter for the New York Times. David, it's good to see you. You and I have spoken multiple times leading up to these talks. Let me just start by getting your initial reaction to this. What awaits the vice president when he returns to the United States?
Well, first of all, no surprise here, Polo. The 2015 agreement took about 2 years to negotiate. It took nearly 70 trips back and forth to Europe for negotiating sessions with the Obama administration. And in the end, what did they get? They got a commitment never to build a nuclear weapon, a commitment Iran's made many times before because it's also a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it has to make that commitment. So that part of the vice president's statement seemed a little confusing. They have already agreed on that issue. Whether they are enforcing that or not is another issue. And then the second part that was really fascinating was he said they will not give up the ability, the tools to be able to build a weapon in the future. And that is code word for they won't give up the stockpile of nuclear fuel and or the right to enrich uranium in the future, the right to produce more in the future. And so it looks like that old sticking point, which led to the breakdown of the negotiations in February that led to the war, is still the sticking point.
Don't go anywhere, David Sanger. I'm wondering if we can now bring in Jennifer Hensler, CNN's senior reporter, just for some additional reporting. What are you hearing about, after hearing from the vice president and the lack of agreement between the Iranians and the United States?
Well, Polo, it's hard to underscore how many unanswered questions we have here in terms of what happens next. We heard from the vice president saying that this was their best and final offer, but we haven't heard a timeline in which they would need the Iranians to respond. We haven't heard, for example, if there'll be working level negotiations that continue beyond this meeting in Islamabad. We also haven't heard questions on what happens next when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. This is, of course, a key issue in all of these negotiations, as the Iranians have basically throttled the freedom of navigation through this critical waterway. This is something that Europe is heavily dependent on, ships being able to transit through this strait. We don't know now if that continues to remain a demand, if there is still going to be a push to have this fully reopened in the coming weeks. We also don't know whether the ceasefire is going to continue to hold for these 2 weeks. This was what was announced, when the president announced this last week, that it would be a 2-week ceasefire. Now that these talks have ended without there being any sort of resolution, will the U.S. continue its military operations here? We don't have answers on all of these in these early hours after the vice president's remarks. He, only gave very, very brief remarks there in Islamabad after this marathon day of negotiations. And so there are a lot of questions that I'm sure we're all going to our sources with right now. So I could try to get some clarity here. But there is a lot at stake coming out of these talks. And we have also yet to hear from the other parties to these negotiations, the Pakistanis as well as the Iranians. I'm sure Tehran will seek to spin this in their own way as well, whether or not they see eye to eye in terms of what is the major gap, as David mentioned, this idea of enrichment and no nuclear weapons. This is something Iranian officials have publicly said. They are not seeking a nuclear weapon. There have not been the ability to verify where they are in terms of enrichment after last year's strikes by U.S. and Israeli forces. The IAEA has not been able to get on the ground since the start of those offensives last year, so that would be key in any deal here. But there, again, I cannot stress how many questions we are seeking to have answers here. Polo.
Jennifer Hansler, thank you so much. We'll let you get back to your sources and do check back with us with any new information. Let's go back to David Sanger now and pick up on where we left off. David, the other thing that took away from that, as the vice president said, it's bad news to Iran more than for the United States. How do the people of Iran take this now, with the president threatening to increase strikes if no deal was reached?
Well, perhaps he will, Polo, but I actually think that with the ceasefire in place, it's going to be a difficult decision for the president to resume the kind of military action that the U.S. was engaged in until a few days ago. Just think, we just saw inflation numbers tick up, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Going back into attacks on Iran would probably send the stock market down, would probably send the price of oil up, would probably promise that there will be significantly more gas price increases and increases in everything else, and fertilizer shortages and shortages of helium to make semiconductors. So I think it would be a difficult decision for the president. I think the Iranians know it. And I think the Iranian message, at least from the government here, was just because we got pounded for 38 days does mean that we have fundamentally changed our view on in the Iranian view, their right to produce uranium and do what other signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty are allowed to do.
What do you read into the fact that we didn't hear the vice president mention the Strait of Hormuz?
Really interesting. I mean, first of all, the Strait of Hormuz opening was supposed to be a condition of the ceasefire.
Right.
It was not even supposed to be a subject of negotiation here. The negotiation here might be, you heard the president float the idea that Iran and the U.S. might run the strait and the tolling from it together. The Iranians obviously are making a claim that they control the strait, and that their military will get involved in doing that. That has not happened during the 47 years of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So remember, though, that the strait crisis was a result of the war. It was not one of the causes of the war. And so that's got to get negotiated almost separately as a way of defanging the Iranians' one big control over the global economy. And frankly, they've discovered in the past month that that's as valuable or more valuable than the prospect that they could get a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, after 21 hours of negotiations, they continue to hold that valuable negotiating chip. David, I have a couple of seconds left with you. Just curious, what's the lingering question that remains on your mind? And technically, do these negotiations remain open-ended?
Well, that's the interesting question. I'm assuming that Vice President Vance gave some kind of deadline, because the last thing the administration wants to do is get sucked into a lengthy negotiation here. But he mentioned no deadline during the course of this time, and the Iranians have to guess whether or not the president's willing to back that up. Now, one thing the U.S. could do, short of a resumed attack, is cut off all traffic coming out of the strait, basically saying if you're going to close it to America and its allies, you could close it to all. But we don't know that he's done that yet.
We don't even know if he's thought about that yet. So we'll have to see. David Sanger, as always, lucky to have that insight. Thank you so much for your time following that breaking news out of the Middle East and specifically out of Islamabad, Pakistan. Stay with CNN. For viewers in the U.S., the premiere of CNN original series, Kara Swisher Wants to Live Forever, starts right now.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Well, good morning, everybody. And let me say a couple of notes of appreciation. First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis, who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Pakistan this hour, the U.S. delegation has left Islamabad after unsuccessful marathon peace talks with Iran. Pakistan, though, vows it will continue to mediate between Washington and Tehran, quote, in the coming days. Well, Iranian media reports Tehran is in no hurry to get back to the negotiating table. That's according to a source close to the Iranian delegation. And until the U.S. agrees to what Tehran deems a reasonable deal, the Strait of Hormuz will effectively remain closed. I want to start with Bijan Hosseini, who has been following developments out of Islamabad, standing by for us this morning in London. Bijan, what happened?
Yeah, Becky, well, as you said, a marathon. These talks went over 20 hours, and they were billed as deeply historic, the highest level of talks between leaders from Iran and the U.S. since Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. And most notably, these were face-to-face, which we rarely see. What happened? Iran came out and said that the U.S. demands were excessive. They were overreaching. We also heard from U.S. Vice President JD Vance with his distrust in the negotiations from the Iranian side. Here's what he had to say.
We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
We heard from a spokesperson from Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying that the two sides couldn't agree on 2 to 3 key issues. That is those issues, we believe, obviously around the Strait of Hormuz. That's been a core dispute between the two sides. JD Vance also alluding to Iran's nuclear enrichment program. We also know that Iran had asked for sanctions relief and that they had also asked for a regional ceasefire, including Israel and Lebanon. It seemed that the U.S. was unwilling to meet there. Before these talks started, U.S. President Donald Trump came out and said that it really made no difference to him whether these talks were successful or not. He said that the U.S. had already won the war. We kind of heard a similar sentiment from Iran. They definitely felt they had the upper hand. They certainly had a lot more leverage given their control over the Strait of Hormuz, which is absolutely disrupted global supply chains. And we know that Iran will not open that up until a reasonable solution is met. So where does that leave us now? Unfortunately, a lot more questions than answers. We know that Qatar had mentioned they were going to restore full maritime navigation in the Persian Gulf today. We know that the U.S. Navy was working to remove some of those mines in the Strait of Hormuz. And we know that Israel and Lebanon were in talks to hold ceasefire talks next week. So now all of that kind of up in the air. This comes after yesterday, no reported attacks on Iran and no reported attacks from Iran onto Israel or their Gulf Arab neighbors, which has been a welcomed sign of some sort of peace and stability. But now all of that up in the air, Becky.
We are following breaking news out of Pakistan, of course. The U.S. delegation has left Islamabad after unsuccessful marathon peace talks with Iran. But Pakistan vows it will continue to mediate between Washington and Tehran in the coming days. Iranian media reports Tehran is in no hurry to get back to the negotiating table. That's according to a source close to the Iranian delegation. And until the U.S. agrees to what Tehran deems a, quote, reasonable deal, the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed. Vice President JD Vance gave this update shortly after those talks concluded. Have a listen.
We have been at it now for 21 hours, and We've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Okay, let's bring in Bijan Hussaini, standing by for us in London. Thank you for being with me again, sir. I appreciate it. Just bring us up to speed on what happened in Islamabad after these marathon talks between the US and Iran ended without a deal. What are you hearing about why they broke down?
Yeah, Ben, it was a marathon over 21 hours. We know U.S. Vice President JD Vance, as well as Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, joining those talks from the U.S. side. From the Iranian side, a delegation of 71 people, including their parliament speaker and their minister of foreign affairs. So notable, these massive key political figures. The first time direct talks with such a high level of figures has taken place face-to-face between these countries in decades. Ultimately failing from the Iranian perspective because the U.S. demands were excessive and overreaching. That's what they said. A spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs coming out and saying that the two countries couldn't agree on 2 to 3 key issues. We heard before this all took place, U.S. President Donald Trump coming out and saying it really didn't make a difference to him whether an agreement was reached or not. He said that the U.S. had already won the war. Iran kind of coming into these talks with that same sentiment. They definitely felt they had the upper hand. They had a bit more leverage given their control over the Strait of Hormuz, which has absolutely devastated global supply chains. We've seen that take place. There's a lot of other issues at play as well. Iran's nuclear enrichment program, relief of sanctions. Iran wanted a regional ceasefire that included Lebanon and Israel. So it seems the two parties were unwilling to meet there in the middle on many of those key issues. So where does that leave us? Well, currently in the middle of a 2-week ceasefire. We know yesterday no reported attacks on Iran, also no reported attacks from Iran on those Gulf states or into Israel. It's been a very welcomed period of calm and stability, especially among those Gulf countries that have kind of been caught in the crossfire. So we don't know what happens to that 2-week ceasefire. We also know Qatar had come out and said they were going to renew maritime navigation in the Strait and in the Persian Gulf. We don't know if that will continue. We know the U.S. Navy was removing mines in the Strait of Hormuz. We don't know what will happen there as well. And we don't know what will happen with Israel and Lebanon. The two countries were speaking about holding potential ceasefire talks next week. So it really feels all of this is up in the air. And unfortunately, a lot more questions right now than answers, Ben.
So many questions. My goodness, there's a lot going on, but you're on top of it. Thank you for that, Bijan Hussaini. We appreciate it. Onwards, some reporters got a glimpse of President Donald Trump just moments after Vance announced he was headed home empty-handed. CNN's Julia Benbrook has all the details for us.
While United States negotiators, including Vice President JD Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner were in Islamabad for these talks with the Iranians, President Donald Trump was here in Florida at a social gathering at the UFC fights, surrounded by family. We also know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio was there, and according to reporters in the room, around that same time that Vance came out and announced that an agreement had not been met, Rubio was seen leaning over to whisper something to Trump there during those fights. We don't know for sure if that was the topic of discussion, but it does seem likely. Now, as Trump traveled out here, he did take some questions from reporters at the White House, and he said he was getting updates on these hours-long talks as they were taking place, but that from his viewpoint, it didn't really matter how the talks went because he believes that the United States has already won this conflict militarily. Take a listen.
We win. No matter what, we've defeated their military. They have no navy. 158 ships are underwater, undersea. All of their minesweepers and all of their, they call them mine droppers. Can you imagine? A country has 28 mine droppers. You think that's nice? With all of that being said, they're all defeated, by the way. They're all at the bottom of the sea. Now, with all of that, they have no navy. They have no radar. They have no air.
Sunday, April 12th. Thank you for joining me. I'm Victor Blackwell. We are following breaking news in the U.S.-Israel-Iran war. The talks ended early this morning with no deal between the U.S. and Iran. This was after hours of negotiation. Vice President JD Vance led negotiations for the U.S. and said there was one specific issue that was a non-starter.
The simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations.
The leader of Tehran's negotiating team says that ultimately the U.S. failed to gain the trust of their delegation. Iranian state media says Tehran has no plans for another round of talks, but an Iranian official left a bit of an opening. He said that simply diplomacy never comes to an end. Pakistan says that it's committed to helping to mediate. During the talks, U.S. Navy destroyers started to clear mines from the Strait of Hormuz to allow ships to pass. The New York Times reports that ships destroyed an Iranian surveillance drone that approached them. The sources stressed that the drone did not violate the already fragile ceasefire. They just didn't want Iranian forces tracking the ship's movements. We have team coverage. CNN's Nick Robertson is live in Islamabad, and Jennifer Hansler is in Washington, D.C. Nick, a long day and early morning. Unfortunately, no deal. What have you learned?
Yeah, what we're hearing from Pakistani sources as the dust begins to settle a little bit here is, their description for them, 29 hours of talks, hectic talks, very heavy involvement of the field marshal, the most powerful man in the country, if you will. And the view that both sides are going to go back and talk to their domestic audiences and say what they need to say to their domestic audiences. But there's a real sense from the bring the two sides together, trying to bridge the gaps, that there was a torpedoed in any way, that there is positivity, and both sides, according to Pakistani sources, don't want to return to the 28th of February, the day when the war began. So there's an implication here that the door for diplomacy is still open, and that's very much how the vice president left it. He said the best and final offer had been given to the Iranian side. The good news was that the talks had happened. The bad news was that they hadn't reached an agreement. On Tuesday into Wednesday this week was a 2-week ceasefire, and no one right now is talking about that ceasefire breaking down. No one's talking about ultimatums of what happens if the other side doesn't make a move. So it does appear that the possibility still to find an agreement exists. I don't think it's going to be happening in the immediate hours as really the heads of delegations return to their capital. It does appear that the door remains open, but the ball does feel at the moment very much in the Iranian court. They feel that they have leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. JD Vance said they did get commitment.
We're having some audio issues there, reporting from Islamabad. I will also say that throughout the talks, the vice president stressed that he was speaking with President Trump consistently. Let's go to Jennifer Hansler in Washington. What else are we learning?
Well, Victor, just in the past half hour or so, we got an update from the traveling press with the vice president that he is still making his long journey back to Washington, D.C. They just stopped for a refuel in Germany. And once he gets back to the U.S., of course, the expectation is that he will be meeting with the president to debrief on what happened. But as he came out of those 21-hour talks last night, he said that he had talked some half dozen times with not only the president, but the entire U.S. national security team, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, the head of CENTCOM, even Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Of course, this aligns with a lot of what would have been discussed in that marathon talk, not only the idea of the nuclear program, but also sanctions relief, the Strait of Hormuz. That would, of course, be an all-encompassing interagency discussion there. Now, of course, Victor, there are still significant gaps between the two sides coming out of this negotiation, coming out with no deal. JD Vance framed the top issue as the nuclear program. However, he did acknowledge that other issues did come up. The Strait of Hormuz was front and center of a lot of the president's rhetoric leading up to these talks, the idea that Iran needed to have full access, full freedom for vessels to move forward there. This is something that the Iranians have used as a key negotiating tool, the fact that they have been able to snarl that key waterway. And something that was interesting in his remarks last night, Victor, is the vice president seemed to acknowledge that there is a deep deficit in trust between the two sides. He said that the U.S. had come into these talks in good faith, that the president had tasked them with negotiating in good faith here, and they said ultimately they were trying to be flexible and they didn't see flexibility from the Iranian side. As Nick was saying, he said this was the U.S.'s best and final offer, but there are still many questions, I would say more questions than answers, that came out of last night and that very brief press conference. The timeline in which the U.S. wants to see a response from Iran, whether there is an ultimatum here. So there is a lot at stake here, Victor.
And of course, we're still waiting for President Trump to weigh in after the end of these talks with no deal. Jennifer Hansler in Washington, thank you. Let's bring in now Aaron David Miller. He's a former State Department Middle East negotiator and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Good morning to you. Let's start here. I've been describing, and many have been describing these talks as marathon talks that went on for 21 hours. The delegation that secured the JCPOA a decade ago says that deal took 18 months. So is it a surprise to you that after 21 hours that the Iranians didn't accept the final and best offer from the U.S.?
No, it's not a surprise, Victor, and thanks for having me. And Victor, I think you broke the code. Look, negotiations under normal circumstances with the Iranians have proven to have only two speeds, slow and slower. 21 hours might seem like a long time, but it really isn't, given the complexity of the issues, given the absence of trust between the two sides. And I made this point before, and I think it's worth making again. The two sides are operating on different clocks, and those clocks, the issue of time, is directly a result of how each side perceives the win-loss here. The Iranians came emboldened with a lot of cards to play. They have the highly enriched uranium. They've threatened the Gulf states. The regime survived. And of course, they've deployed geography to manage and control the straits. Administration has cards. It's hollowed out Iran's military, tremendous economic devastation. But I'm thinking the president is in a lot more of a hurry to get out of this thing than the Iranians are. And that is going to embolden Iran's position. So negotiations are not dead, but it's hard to believe, given the complexity of the issues, that they're going to resume anytime soon, or that an agreement is going to be reached.
Yeah. The vice president said that the U.S. had not seen a fundamental commitment of will not to seek a nuclear weapon. The Iranians say publicly that they're not developing a nuclear weapon, but they're committed to uranium enrichment. But the President Trump's assumption, or at least he's been convinced, that the military victories, taking out the Navy, taking out the Air Force, would break that will. Is that the original miscalculation here?
Other than the fact that this was a war of choice, there was no critical or overwhelming imperative to do this. Yes, Iran is a brutal, authoritarian, repressive regime, and yes, it threatens its neighbors. The question is, how do you define success and the metrics in such a war? And the reality is, Iranian and U.S. negotiators have struggled since 2013 to get a conclusive result on the issue of Iran's putative nuclear weapons program and the right to enrich. I don't think there was any way in 21 hours or 21 days that negotiators would break the back of this thing. There could have been progress, perhaps, on what to do about the highly enriched uranium, 900 pounds. I think the Iranians have agreed at some point to dilute it. But the notion that this regime, now dominated by the IRGC, Victor, convinced it's winning, was going to give up in an initial round of negotiation something that it has clung to for years is just untethered from reality. If that's the expectation of the administration, these were doomed to fail.
So the VP also says the U.S. did not get this commitment. President Trump said this leading into the talks. I want to play for you how he frames the consequences of not getting a deal, at least before he didn't get the deal. Watch.
We win, no matter what. Their leaders are all dead. Khomeini is gone. For many years he ruled. He's gone. With all of that, let's see what happens. But from my standpoint, I don't care.
Most experts and analysts I've spoken with said the president's looking for an off-ramp. Do you expect a resumption of hostilities, continuation of hostilities? If the president says, we won, I don't care?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a couple weeks of grace here. But this really is a strategic conundrum for the administration. Their options are not good. They can go back to the battlefield. But I'm thinking no amount of kinetic energy and kinetic activity, military strikes, is going to break the back of this regime. You know, they could deploy 250,000 troops. You could do in Iraq. Fundamentally occupy the country, try to take over the regime. That's simply not practical or feasible. I suspect now, Victor, the focus is going to be on the straits. What to do about the straits? If a way could be found to open them at an acceptable cost, forget all the rest of this stuff. The nukes, the proxies, the ballistic missiles, all that stuff. President does care, and he needs to figure out a way to get inflation down, to get the prices of gas down. And it won't happen for months, by the way. But he needs to create a pathway where normal humans believe that, in fact, on the economic side, we're going to get an improvement in this situation. That means opening the straits. And that, I think, is the challenge that the administration, and to some degree, if the Iranians want economic relief, challenge they're going to face as well.
The world is on edge this morning after 21 hours of talks between the U.S. and Iran failed to produce a deal. Overnight, Vice President JD Vance departing Pakistan with major questions about how President Trump will respond and if the fragile 2-week ceasefire will last. The talks were the highest level between U.S. and Iran since 1979. But when will they continue and what will they produce? The Vice President asserting that the ball is now in Iran's court.
The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We leave here with a very simple proposal, a method of understanding that is our final and best offer. We'll see if the Iranians accept it.
So what comes next? For that, I'm joined by CNN's Nick Robertson, live in Islamabad, who questioned Vance at that press conference last night. So, Nick, what are the sticking points that have so far prevented a deal, and do we know if there will be any more direct talks?
The core issue from Vice President JD Vance's view was the fact that Iran has not agreed to rule out uranium enrichment to the point of making a weapon. He said there was absolutely no strong and long-term commitment from them. From the Iranian perspective, it's all about the leverage they believe they have with the Strait of Hormuz, and they don't feel that they're getting enough in return for it. That's where things stand. We also understand Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff have also left. There are no U.S. negotiators at technical senior level at all left behind here in Pakistan. Also, we understand Iranian negotiators have returned to Tehran. So there's no one here to do the talking. Pakistani officials remain optimistic. They describe the talks here over a 21-hour period as hectic, involving the most powerful man in Pakistan, the field marshal here, that he was involved. They do say, the Pakistanis do say, and they were the interlocutors here, they were in the room in these trilateral talks that went all the way through the night marathon. The talks were ongoing when the sun went down. They were ongoing when the sun came up. And the Pakistani officials that we're talking to, sources here, are saying that both sides do not want to return to February the 28th when the war began. But it is not clear precisely what the next moves are going to be. It does appear as if we're in a position now where both sides have to see, let the dust settle, see what their next moves are going to be, how they're going to frame those moves. Because I think absent last night with the Vice President saying this is our full and final offer, we didn't get a sense of, okay, here's the deadline for that offer. Here's what happens if you don't make and reach agreement on that offer. But I think there's a real worry in the region right now that while you don't have momentum towards a positive outcome, you have spoilers, as people describe here in the region, who are going to try to spin a negative message and potentially tip this back to a slow and steady escalation back towards conflict again.
All right, Nick Robertson from Islamabad this morning. Thank you for the latest on those talks. And so let's break this all down with my excellent panel of reporters this morning. Politico's Dasha Burns, CNN's David Chalian, and Jasmine Wright from Notice. Good morning to you all. It was a late night of news, as there tends to happen in the Trump era.
Especially on the weekends.
Yes, especially on the weekends. We tend to learn that Sunday mornings here. Dasha, you cover the White House. Trump's going to wake up to this news. I'm sure he knows what he's going to say this morning. What are you hearing from your sources about how he plans to process this? The fact that they left without a deal, the fact that there are major sticking points still on the table, and whether he's going to allow these talks to continue, or will he go back and attack Iran?
Well, look, this is not the way that the president thought this would go. This entire time, they've been making these parallels to Venezuela. They wanted the Speaker of the Parliament in Iran to sort of be their new Delcy Rodriguez. That is not how it is working out. And the president has put himself in a tough spot here because he has made the threats. I mean, he has escalated as high as you can escalate, talking about ending an entire civilization this week. And where do you go from there?
Yeah.
He went all the way and then scaled back. Can he go all the way again and have that credibility that he could actually go through with it when he didn't this time around? So he's in a tough spot, and this is a problem for him, that he's been wanting to be the president that finally solves the problem of Iran for everyone. I was looking back this week. He was talking about Iran as early as 2007 to 2011. You know, this is one of the few issues that he has been consistent on, and he has now put himself in a tough spot here.
But how much patience does Trump have for negotiations like this, David? I mean, like, these are major sticking points. Just to underline what Nick was reporting about what is still on the table here. With the Strait of Hormuz, Iran refused to relinquish leverage over that critical choke point. The U.S. has demanded that Iran do that. They said they'll do this after there's a peace deal. We'll see if that happens. Iran wants the release of about $27 billion in frozen revenue. That's not what the Americans have agreed to. And of course, it is the uranium, about 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium that the United States is very concerned about. These things take a lot of time. Is Donald Trump willing to give it that time?
A lot of time, and we've been through quite a circuitous route here. I mean, Midnight Hammer back in June, according to the president, totally obliterated the nuclear sites and the nuclear program, and now we're at a place where there's no deal because the vice president says the Iranians refuse to say that they won't have a nuclear program. I mean, these things, that's quite a journey from June to now in this year, including the 5 weeks of intense kinetic military combat in Iran. Manu, it seemed pretty clear, to your point, Dasha, about if you go to, I'm going to annihilate an entire civilization, and then get to the ceasefire, I don't know how you can read that any way other than Donald Trump is not all that desirous about going back into conflict. Like, I think he wants an off-ramp here, and I think he wants that. And you listed three. I think he'll take anything that he can sort of point to allow this time frame to extend of not being back in a full.
Well, this is why I was so surprised
conflict.
that it was a full there is no deal coming out of here, because he needs just something to be able to say, we've got some victory, we've got some traction here. And there are a lot of different ways to spin that, but they are coming out fully empty-handed.
But if you heard the president on Saturday when he was asked on the tarmac, he didn't say that the negotiations were going well. So it's actually not really all that surprising that there wasn't some concrete deal that came out of it, because when the president was talking about it, he didn't say they were going well, and he said that if a deal wasn't made, the U.S. would be fine. I was talking to White House officials on Friday who were effectively kind of planning for what happens after the ceasefire takes hold. They were really optimistic that a deal could come out of it, saying, well, we're going to get to this in a couple of weeks. We're going to get to that in a couple of weeks. And so this obviously presents a major problem for the president. I was talking to one source close to the White House who, when that ceasefire announced, frankly said, quite pessimistically, the war is likely to resume because the gaps are too far apart from those places, and not just the 15-point plan versus the 10-point plan that the White House says isn't actually a 10-point plan, but those major sticking points. And so while JD Vance says that it is the nuclear ambitions that is the problem, the Iranians say that there are about 2-3 problems. And so how do you bridge that and do it within that 2-week threshold that they have?
I mean, if Trump could say, okay, you may want to take any deal to say he's got a deal, but if Iran is able to continue what the United States has been concerned about, whether it's the nuclear program or have a stranglehold of the Strait of Hormuz, then what do they get out of the war to begin with?
Yeah, and I go back to this idea of regime change. The president says that wasn't the goal, but regime change happened. The son of the Ayatollah, I had a source close to the White House who's a huge supporter of the president say, listen, you killed this guy's father, you killed his wife, and you expect him to be more willing to negotiate, less radical than his father was. Iran is coming from a position of ideology and from a position of we're willing to sacrifice anything to look powerful and to stand up for this country. They don't have much to lose here in the same way that the United States does.
And what do we think about JD Vance's role in all this? I mean, interestingly, last night, Marco Rubio, who had been heavily involved in an Iran hawk for so many years, has been heavily involved in this strategy. He was actually at the UFC fight in Miami with Trump last night, not negotiating this deal with Iran. Vance, on the other hand, who has not been on the forefront of Iran, was taking the lead here.
Yeah, although I guess Trump and Rubio were taking phone calls from Vance and the negotiating team throughout. But it is really interesting because Trump kind of acknowledged that he put JD Vance forward for what was going to be a really big moment of potential opportunity for him in terms of a leadership role here. What is so fascinating is obviously all of the reporting has said that Vance was one of the most skeptical inside the administration about this from the outset, playing the role of the loyal lieutenant, no doubt. But the fact that he now is the face of we have no deal, and hanging in the balance is what happens next because of that. If JD Vance is the face of we have no deal and that causes back to war, I mean, that is so against the grain of what Vance had sort of put forward publicly about his interests in this area.
Speaking of which, just as a flashback of what JD Vance has said about the U.S. engaging in foreign wars.
We're going to stop sending our young people to faraway lands. We are not the policemen of the world. If you're worried about the world spinning out of control, if you're worried about a military draft, if you're worried about, God forbid, a world war, the best way to prevent it is to vote for Donald Trump.
And I hate to say this, but America is not good at micromanaging wars in the Middle East.
Not good at micromanaging wars in the Middle East.
And then there he finds himself. I mean, it's fascinating. The president obviously asked him, according to sources, to go to Islamabad to lead these negotiations. The president, when asked what JD Vance has to prove, he said nothing. But, that's not really looking at the prospects of 2028. I followed Vice President Kamala Harris a lot. Obviously, she did not get these opportunities from President Biden, but it still put her in a difficult position to not just defend what the Biden administration had to do once she inevitably ran, but to mark that against her own record. And JD Vance, if he does run in 2028, which people close to him believe that is obviously very closely on his mind, he will have to do that same thing. And so you're seeing, yes, it's playing out in real time now, and obviously the war is important, but then what happens in 2028?
The U.S. delegation has now left Islamabad after unsuccessful marathon peace talks with Iran. Pakistan, though, vows it will continue to mediate between Washington and Tehran, quote, in the coming days. Iranian media reports Tehran is in no hurry to get back to the negotiating table. That's according to a source close to the Iranian delegation. And until the U.S. agrees to what Tehran deems a reasonable deal. They say the Strait of Hormuz will effectively remain closed. Well, the US Vice President had this to say shortly after the talks concluded.
We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Well, CNN's Nick Robertson with more now from Islamabad.
So this is where we just heard from the Vice President. No deal on the talks with Iran over 16 hours, an absolute marathon session through the night here in the center of Islamabad. It is dawn now. When the talks began on Saturday, it was late afternoon, and we've quite literally witnessed the sun go down and then the sun come up again. And what the Vice President has said is that Iran, he doesn't believe, is giving that fundamental core agreement about its nuclear aspirations. He didn't say what happens next. He didn't talk about a specific end to the ceasefire. He didn't say if it's a return to war. But what he said the United States has done is given Iran its final and best offer. The ball, it appears, is in Iran's court to come up with answers now that it hasn't been able to through this marathon session of talks. The Vice President also saying that through the night he continually kept President Trump briefed and updated. He said that he'd come into these talks positive, but fundamentally the Vice President coming in looking, he hoped, to get a relatively quick solution. The Iranians with a much larger delegation and a much different negotiating style coming into these talks with perhaps the aspiration, as they have done in the past, of talking, drilling down, getting what they wanted. Fundamentally, also, the Iranians believe that they still hold cards, that they can still control the Strait of Hormuz, and to them, that is something that is leverage, real leverage, they believe, and that it could get more than they were offered here in Islamabad.
Well, joining me now from Reston, Virginia, is Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and author of Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. The JCPOA nuclear deal feels like the distant past, doesn't it? A decade on. What's your view of where we are now?
Well, clearly this first round did not work out, and perhaps there won't be any other rounds. I wrote prior to these negotiations that the most likely outcome actually was that there would be a no-deal new status quo, one in which the U.S. nevertheless pulls out of this war. The Iranians continue to control the Strait of Hormuz. There's no agreement, but a new status quo is reached in which the two sides, the U.S. and Iran, do not go back into war, and then the question is what the Israelis will do. And the reason I wrote that is because the two sides are still too far away from each other on some of the core issues. The nuclear is, of course, one of them. That's the only one that JD Vance spoke about. But another critical one is the position on Lebanon, in which the Iranians are insisting that the ceasefire has to encompass Israel and Lebanon as well. And so far, it appears that the United States is pushing back quite hard against that, because the Israeli position is that they're going to continue to bomb that country, regardless of what happens between the United States and Iran.
Hold that thought. I'm going to come back to that. Let me just put to you what Middle East correspondent for The Economist, Greg Karlstrom, notes about these talks. And he says, on the positive side, this is the highest level diplomatic engagement between America and Iran since 1979. There is still time for another round. He also points to major constraints, including too many issues to get through in 10 days. And that, of course, would be the end of this current ceasefire, 2-week ceasefire. Significant psychological gap, he says, between the two sides, with each side believing the other is under pressure. How much do you think that perception gap is now shaping the trajectory of these US-Iran talks? And I wonder whether the positives, if you see any in it, suggest that there is still political will on both sides to keep diplomacy alive and not go back into this war. I'm speaking very specifically from the US Iran perspectives as you see them at this point?
No, undoubtedly, there were a lot of positives. I mean, this is the first time you had the vice president speak directly to the Speaker of the Iranian parliament, who in effect is a much more important figure than the traditional Speaker of the parliament would be, given a lot of the changes that have taken place in the Iranian system. The fact that the Iranians brought such a large delegation, this is the largest delegation I've ever seen the Iranians bring, and far beyond what we saw during the JCPOA talks, including the head of the central bank, which suggests that the Iranians were there thinking at least that there would be serious discussions about sanctions relief. So all of that is positive, and it's absolutely true. We're about 5 or 6 days into the 2-week ceasefire. So there's definitely time for a second, perhaps even a third round. And perhaps there is a psychological element in which neither side actually wanted to have an agreement right away, because it could give the impression that they gave in too quickly to the demands of the other side. They need to give the impression that there were some really, really hard negotiations, not just long negotiations. So it will remains to be seen as to whether there will be a second round or not. And as your correspondent pointed out, neither the Iranians nor the American side have said that there will not be a second round or that this is the end of the talks period. But having said that, I would say, though, I think the most likely scenario, nevertheless, is that they don't come to an agreement, but they nevertheless do not go back to war in the same manner that existed before this conflict, before this round of talks.
That's really interesting. I want to get on to Lebanon. Before I do, briefly, there has been reporting about Andy Baker, who is, as I understand it, a Persian-speaking Deputy National Security Advisor, accompanying JD Vance when he was in Islamabad, described as an America First advocate and a key voice in shaping U.S. foreign policy. He was National Advisor, Security Advisor to JD Vance himself. How significant do you believe Andy Baker, or someone with that kind of background and approach, is so close to these Iran talks? And what does it suggest, do you think, about any sort of direction of U.S. strategy at this point?
Well, I mean, Andy is the Deputy National Security Advisor, so it's not terribly surprising that he would accompany JD to these talks. He also used to be JD's National Security Advisor in his earlier position. So the fact that he's participating in these talks is not necessarily surprising. At the end of the day, this was a higher level delegation from both sides. Now, whether the U.S. side brought all of the type of experts needed for this talk is a different story. At the end of the day, if the focus truly was on the nuclear issue, I'm not entirely sure that that is where the main sticking point was. That is not, the nuclear issue is not something that the U.S. and Iran can resolve, even with a 21-hour negotiation or 16-hour negotiation, given the technical challenges that that brings about. So at best, it could have been a framework agreement, and everything else would have been resolved in the technical talks.
Let's talk about Lebanon and Israel. You wrote that there is a suggestion, quote, that Vance's surprising focus on the nuclear file as a reason for the deadlock is a pretext to cover up the real problem in the talks, that being Israel's continued bombardment of Lebanon. As we speak, we see smoke rising over the skyline of Beirut. What does this tell us about what is actually driving this deadlock, do you believe? And where do you see any Israel-Lebanon talks going at this point?
Well, let me first explain why I think from the Iranian side, the Lebanon angle is very, very difficult for them to show flexibility on. From the Iranian perspective, it is absolutely imperative that they do not come across as abandoning Hezbollah and Lebanon. There already is a perception amongst the Shias in Lebanon that in 2024, Iran abandoned them. And I think that the leadership in Iran now is adamant about making sure that that perception is not reinforced, but rather reversed. But also, the Iranians recognize that if the Israelis continue to bomb Lebanon, then there is a significant spillover risk, meaning that that war eventually would reach Iran as well. In fact, twice in the last 2 years, it already has. And in the second time, we saw how the Iranians escalated horizontally throughout the entire Persian Gulf. Since the Iranian position is to make sure that this war ends, not just a ceasefire, and that it ends in a durable manner, it means that it's necessary from their standpoint to also put out the fire in the Lebanese theater. Otherwise, that fire will reach Iran. But the most important factor, I think, is that for the Iranians, this is a test to see whether the United States is capable of controlling and reining in Israel. Because if it isn't, if it's unwilling or unable to do so, it raises critical questions in the Iranian mind about what the value of an agreement with the United States is. Because if Israel can continue that war and also start new wars, and the United States cannot stop that, and the United States cannot stop itself from joining in with those wars, again, what would the value of a deal with the United States be if that is the lack of control that the United States has over Israel?
Good to get your perspective, Trita. Important thoughts on what is an incredibly important day. Thank you. Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said he is not done with Iran yet. He made those comments Saturday as peace talks were underway, of course, between the US and Iran.
The campaign is not over yet, but we can clearly state that we have historic achievements. I want to remind where we were. Iran tried to strangle us. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Assad regime in Syria, the militia in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Iran itself. They wanted to strangle us, and we strangled them. They threatened us with destruction, and now they are fighting to survive. We affected them, and we have more to do.
Well, Netanyahu also said he has approved direct talks with Lebanon next week as Israel ramps up attacks on Hezbollah targets. The Iranian-backed militant group has also continued firing at Israel, launching a barrage of drones and rockets on Saturday. And of course, as we've just been discussing, Iran insisting that a broader ceasefire must include an end to Israeli strikes in Lebanon. So let's get you bang up to date on what we understand to be going on that front. CNN's Oren Liebman joining me now from Jerusalem. And in light of the breakdown in these talks in Islamabad, and we've been discussing the significance of those and perhaps the consequence. What do you make of what we are seeing and hearing where you are in Israel and in Lebanon?
Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu clearly said right at the top of the video message, and you saw that top right there, that the campaign against Iran isn't over yet. He didn't specifically say whether he was for or against the ceasefire negotiations, but he and Israeli officials clearly believed from the very beginning that they would fail, just as they believed that the diplomatic effort between the U.S. and Iran before the war, some 40 days ago, would also fail. Now, Israel hasn't simply restarted strikes on Iran and attacks on facilities there just because the ceasefire talks fell apart, but that is clearly what Israel is preparing for. That being said, it's likely President Donald Trump who has the ultimate say there, and Israel knows that, Netanyahu knows that. Still, it was very clear going into these ceasefire talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, that Israel wasn't done yet. It had a longer target list. It was ready for more days or weeks of war, and that's the position Israel is in right now. We've heard from a few of Israel's ministers that they demand that the highly enriched uranium be removed, and if not, it'll be either an agreement or back to war. So we have seen some comment, none from Netanyahu since the statement last night, but it's clear that Israel's position is it's not done yet. It's ready to resume the war as we've seen it before. And that's his position at this moment as it waits to see what the next steps are from the U.S., as there is still time left officially in this 2-week ceasefire. Now, when it comes to Lebanon, as you point out, Netanyahu said he had authorized the direct talks that'll take place on Tuesday, but it's the same question as we saw with the Iran talks. Are these going to lead anywhere? Netanyahu said he's demanding a complete disarmament of Hezbollah as part of the agreement, and something that he sees as a true peace agreement that he said would last for generations. From where we sit right now, that's very difficult to achieve, so it's possible we're looking at simply a smaller version of what happened in Pakistan. Significant direct talks, a noteworthy agreement, but one that ultimately leads nowhere. Meanwhile, unlike the ceasefire in Iran, we are seeing continued Israeli strikes in Lebanon. You pointed out the smoke rising from the suburbs of Beirut, and we are seeing sirens warning of incoming Hezbollah fire in northern Israel today. So no ceasefire in Lebanon as we await these talks in D.C. in just a couple of days.
Oren Liebman is in Jerusalem. Thank you so much. Well, a new poll shows that Israel is losing support among Americans, according to the Pew Research Center, 6 in 10 Americans have an unfavorable view of Israel. That is up 7 points since last year and nearly 20 points since 2022. This poll was taken about 1 month into the US-Israeli war with Iran. 59% of Americans surveyed said they have little or no confidence in Netanyahu to do the right thing regarding world affairs. And the majority of younger Americans on both sides of the aisle now rate Israel and Netanyahu negatively. Speaker of the Iranian parliament and key Iranian negotiator posting his thoughts on social media just moments ago. Mohammad Khalibaf wrote, quote, "Before the negotiations, I emphasized that we have the necessary good faith and will, but due to the experiences of the 2 previous wars, we have no trust in the opposing side." And he goes on to write, quote, "America has understood our logic and principles, and now it's time for it to decide whether it can earn our trust or not." Well, for more on this, Alanud Hamad Saud Al Thani is a fellow at the Middle East Council and on Global Affairs, joining us from Doha, Qatar this morning. It's good to have you. Incredibly important moment to be speaking. We are seeing a lull in strikes across the Gulf, at least where I am in the UAE, as this ceasefire continues. What do you make of the news from Islamabad and the potential impact on the relative calm that we see in this region?
Well, first, thank you for having me. So I don't think a lot of people had very high hopes for the talks in Islamabad, just from the tone that we were hearing from both sides leading up to these talks. It just didn't seem like there was a high chance that there would be an agreement. We've also seen this pattern previously, particularly in Lebanon and in Palestine, where these ceasefires or temporary ceasefires were kind of used as a pause to make the other side, specifically Palestine or Lebanon, lose any kind of edge that they had during that time. And so a lot of people were wondering if that was the case at this moment. And the more time goes on, the more it starts to seem that, yes, it is the case. It's more of a pause to allow, for any infighting to come to the surface in Iran, for any issues that they might have, for them to deal with it. And so it seems that that was really one of the major purposes of this negotiation.
JD Vance specifically said Iran is not prepared to give the US what it needs in terms of confidence about its ability to build a bomb effectively and its long-term sort of ability to do so, whether or not it is currently doing that. And that, he says, is why he left. I just wonder at this point then, and given what you've just said, where does this leave the Gulf? We know that the Strait of Hormuz is absolutely critical to this region as a point of negotiation at this point. In fact, this region says it's economic terrorism. There will be no negotiation over the freedom of navigation there. Qatar, for example, has said this weekend that maritime navigation will fully resume across the Persian Gulf from Sunday. That would seem to suggest a growing confidence by Doha that the strait is navigable, at least for Qatar. Are we seeing the emergence of bilateral negotiations, do you believe, at this point?
So it was never clear that there was any bilateral negotiations. In fact, I believe that there was a clear rejection of bilateral negotiations by the latest that we've heard from the official spokesperson for Qatar, I believe. And so I would go to venture to say that that's not the case. But what it does seem to be is perhaps there was some level of hope in the region that at least the issue of the Strait of Hormuz would be resolved, particularly because Iran's allies want it to be resolved. So China is a major party that is being impacted by the restrictions happening in the Strait of Hormuz. And so it appears that there would be, a want for this issue at least to be resolved, especially since we heard from CENTCOM yesterday that they're trying to circumvent Iran entirely by demining the area. So Iran has claimed that they have mined the area near Oman. And so it seems that they're trying to just cut Iran out of this entirely.
We are seeing Gulf states assess the damage caused by these reckless and unprovoked attacks by Iran during this past 6-week period. We are seeing some restoration of capacity, and we are seeing a continuation of major energy operations even after strikes, including news from Saudi of Hormuz. The pipeline's throughput was down 700,000 barrels a day due to attacks. It is now, as we understand it, restored from this communication that our viewers are seeing on the screen now. Is that resilience or a sign that Saudi and others are being forced into sort of permanent risk and mitigation management? I just want to get your view on that.
Right. So Iran is a bit complicated in the region in terms of its history. It's not so clear-cut as other conflicts has been, in the sense that, yes, Iran is the one who got attacked first in this case. There is no debate about that, and that should never have happened. However, Iran in and of itself has always made itself a threat to its neighbors. I mean, just in 2024, they bombed Pakistan and got bombed back by Pakistan without need to mention everything in Syria and in other capitals, as well as the attacks that have been happening in the GCC just recently. So everyone in the region already sees Iran as a threat even before this war began. However, the issue is, I believe the GCC is taking a wait-and-see approach rather than jumping headfirst or diving in headfirst into the thick of the chaos without having any real guarantees of where this conflict may go. Because I just don't think that anyone here has the appetite to get stuck in this quagmire with a state that clearly is very difficult to negotiate with and is very difficult to come to any real agreement with, even before this war ever started.
Pakistan says that it will continue to mediate between Iran and the US, quote, in the days to come, after what were marathon talks failed to result in a permanent peace deal. Now, Iran's foreign ministry said earlier 2 or 3 key issues prevented Tehran and Washington from striking a deal in Islamabad, despite reports from Iranian media that Tehran is in no hurry for another round of negotiations. An Iranian official says, quote, diplomacy never comes to an end. Well, even before the talks concluded, President Donald Trump has said it made no difference to him if a deal was reached, claiming the US had already achieved a military victory in Iran.
Nick Robertson from CNN. Precisely what have they rejected here? Can you help us understand it a little bit?
Well, I won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we've negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term? We haven't seen that yet. We hope that we will.
Well, Qatar's transport ministry says all forms of maritime navigation will fully resume in the Persian Gulf starting today. It is unclear whether there has been any coordination with Iran surrounding that initiative. Well, despite the ceasefire announcement easing oil markets in recent days, gas prices in the US remain high. I'm talking about gasoline prices, of course. The national average is hovering around $4.13 per gallon, according to AAA Auto Association. Analysts argue it could take weeks for gas to dip below $4 again, and months for prices to return to pre-war levels, whatever happens at this point. Well, for more on this, we're joined by the retired Royal Navy Commodore Simon Kelly, live from Portsmouth in England. JD Vance there. not actually speaking to what is going on in the Strait of Hormuz. We know it is incredible leverage for the Iranian side, of course, and we know it is an absolute flashpoint for the global economy and, you know, more than a priority for the US and indeed this Gulf region very specifically to get some movement there. What do you understand to be going on in the Strait right now?
Yeah, good morning, Becky. It's been a really interesting 24 hours in the Strait because we've seen a couple of really significant moments, actually. So I think the timing of one of them was very interesting. So as the Vice President was sitting down to the start of talks, we saw Central Command, so the US sending through the USS Frank E. Peterson and the Michael Murphy, 2 cruiser destroyers through the Straits of Hormuz. They said that was setting the conditions for mine clearance in the Strait. So those are 2 incredibly capable, sort of high-end war-fighting cruiser destroyers. And they were probably there to sort of test to see what was happening, but also to start to build confidence in the international community that perhaps there aren't any mines laid there. And it sets the ground to then get some shipping through, but also some follow-on mine warfare effort. But at the same time, we also saw the first very large crude carriers pass through the Strait in the other direction. So 3 of them all heading off to Asia. And at the same time today, we're then expecting to see a couple of these large vessels moving into the Gulf. So it's been a really interesting 24 hours from a maritime perspective.
Is there evidence that those US ships, Navy ships, made it through?
That's a really interesting question. There was, I think I saw some early reporting that they hadn't made it through, but everything that I've seen since has indicated that they have done. And in fact, actually, I saw that there had been a sort of a small flash of the AIS system. So that's a sort of like a GPS beacon, so to speak, to show where one of those ships had been. I wonder whether they did that publicly or could have been spoofing, not really sure. But everything at the moment is indicating they did make it in and they made it back again, which is really positive and quite bold. It's a really confident move by the US Navy.
That's fascinating. So I guess this begs the question, you know, diplomacy aside, the talks have broken down. We have no idea whether that means the collapse of this ceasefire that we are currently in. This is a 2-week period, and certainly it is unclear what a peace deal or a solution to this is going forward. We await sort of further developments on that. Meantime, given what you've just said, what does that mean for what comes next at sea, including insurers, businesses, and oil prices?
I think what comes next is we'll start to see a flow of traffic, but there's a sort of double-edged sword there. The US efforts to get through the sort of the center of the strait there will be about re-establishing this United Nations Convention law of the sea, the transit passage that is so essential, not just for the Straits of Hormuz, but sort of for the global rule-based system. But what we might see, and what we've seen from those initial tankers, is that they'll start to go through, and they've gone through using the Iranian route via sort of over the north. And that will involve the Iranians sort of checking the details, probably a payment, but nobody's openly declaring that, or in terms of how much it's likely to be. The problem with that is that will start to establish the Iranian position as being the organization that's able to give you safe passage. And so that's a really, really challenging position when what we want to see is for freedom of movement and open. And it may start to constrain who goes through as the Iranians hold the lever on exactly which vessel, which nation, which flag. And a lot of this is about the maritime operators, about the ships and the captains having the confidence to go through.
Donald Trump talked last week about the potential for a joint venture in the Strait between the US and Iran, knocking back any notion of Iran operating the Strait, you know, sort of as a toll booth, effectively. And certainly nobody in this region wants to see that. That wouldn't work like Panama or that Suez does, in that those are both owned by countries, Egypt and Panama, of course, and they can charge accordingly. My understanding when talking to people here in the business have suggested that potentially a joint venture could potentially look like an agreement between the US and Iran to provide safety and security for shippers, a sort of, some sort of contract that businesses or shippers and insurers would sign up to, which could effectively mean that was still operating within the bounds of the UN sort of convention on the seas, despite the fact that, of course, Iran hasn't signed up to that. What do you make of that? I'm just interested in what options might look like and how the US might have a role and a financial gain to be had out of the strait.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. How on earth you would negotiate the mechanism between the two sides there, I don't know, because I think this is going to be a sticking point anyway. But it would set a worrying precedent. I can see why the pressure of the markets and fuel prices and other commodities will place an onus on the administration to get something done. But you've got to have an end state where potentially maybe that's a starting position, but how you move from that back to full freedom of movement is really difficult. And again, on Truth Social, the president followed an article about creating some kind of a blockade there as well. None of this is going to help reassure the merchant community that we're going to see a freeing of movement, and that which will therefore reassure.
Sunday, April 12th. Thank you for joining me. I'm Victor Blackwell. We are following breaking news in the U.S.-Israel-Iran war. The talks ended early this morning with no deal between the U.S. and Iran. This was after hours of negotiation. Vice President JD Vance led negotiations for the U.S. and said there was one specific issue that was a non-starter.
The simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations.
The leader of Tehran's negotiating team says that ultimately the U.S. failed to gain the trust of their delegation. Iranian state media says Tehran has no plans for another round of talks, but an Iranian official left a bit of an opening. He said that simply diplomacy never comes to an end. Pakistan says that it's committed to helping to mediate. During the talks, U.S. Navy destroyers started to clear mines from the Strait of Hormuz to allow ships to pass. The New York Times reports that ships destroyed an Iranian surveillance drone that approached them. The sources stressed that the drone did not violate the already fragile ceasefire. They just didn't want Iranian forces tracking the ship's movements. We have team coverage. CNN's Nick Robertson is live in Islamabad, and Jennifer Hansler is in Washington, D.C. Nick, a long day and early morning. Unfortunately, no deal. What have you learned?
Yeah, what we're hearing from Pakistani sources as the dust begins to settle a little bit here is, their description